Good evening. My name is Rosemary Hagiwara, pronouns she, her. I'm the Chief Election Officer with the City of Vancouver. Welcome everyone to our second Candidates Information Session. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that the 2022 Vancouver election is taking place on the traditional, unceded, ancestral, and shared territories of the Pancomanum Squamish-speaking peoples, including the Musqueam Indian Band, Squamish Nation, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. These nations have stewarded the land since time immemorial. This session is being recorded and will be made available at vancouver.ca/vote after this event. We intend to keep our attendees anonymous. We will not mention the names of those asking questions. Only the organizers will see this. You may view more accurate transcription through the stream text link, which is now in the chat, or you can also find it from the email we sent out today. We also have registered American Sign Language interpreters with us tonight. There's no need to worry about being on mute as we have deactivated this function. If you have a question for the panelists, we will address them at the end of the presentation. Please click on the icon with a Q&A on your screen to leave your question. If you have technical questions or questions for our organizers, please use the chat button. The chat button will otherwise be deactivated for communicating with others to minimize the disruption. You may also use the closed captioning feature. The plan for tonight is to cover important upcoming dates leading up to the election, who is eligible to become a candidate, the roles of the City, Elections BC, and Ministry of Municipal Affairs. You will have an opportunity to hear from the representatives from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Elections BC. At the end of all the presentations, we will have approximately 30 minutes for questions. Those attending in person, you will be given instructions on how to submit your questions. Let us get started now with the dates that you should be aware of. The election period is now ending on September 16th. Pre-campaign period will start on July 18th for about 2 months, and Elections BC will speak about advertising rules around this time. The nomination period begins on August 30th, and September 9th is the last day. This is when candidates will be submitting their nomination documents. Session 4 will cover more around how to complete the nomination documents. Nomination packages will be available in mid-July, so subscribe to our mailing list to get updates from our office. August 30th is the date where voters list is available for inspection. Voters can request to obscure their information or omit from the list. Also note that August 31st is the first day of when election signs can be posted in the city, and they must be removed within 48 hours after the election. This is 45 days before general voting day. Our website will have the information, and we'll cover more in our session number 4. September 9 is the last day of nomination, and after 4 p.m., candidates who have submitted completed nomination documents will be declared as candidates, and it is also when the challenge to a candidacy begins. September 16 at 4 p.m. is the last day for candidates to withdraw from the election, and also the last day for a court to make a decision on any candidacy challenges. Also note that the random ballot name draw will begin a bit after 5 o'clock in Council Chamber, and this event will be streamed. Campaign period begins on September 17th, and Elections BC will speak to this more later on. And of course, October 15th, the most important day, is Election Day. After 8 p.m. at the close of voting, results will start coming in around 9 o'clock, so you can tune into our website or the newscast to get updates on the results of the election. After general voting day, October 19 by 4 p.m. is when the declaration of the official results will be made. October 20th, I will be reaching out to elected mayor and council. Park Board and Vancouver School Board will be reached out by the representative equivalent to my position, and information will be provided on the inauguration ceremony, and also when the first council or board meetings will take place. November 18th is the last day to apply to the court to challenge elected candidates or the validity of the election. A tip for candidates, filing your campaign financial disclosure should be done as soon as possible after the election. Consequences will be disqualified for the next election, and Elections BC will speak a bit more about this. Once the disclosure is filed with Elections BC, you will get your nomination deposit back, and that is submitted at the time of when you submit your nomination documents. A schedule of these important days will be included in the nomination package that will be made available in mid-July. So other dates that you should be aware of, and these dates will be announced in July. The advance voting will begin between October 1st and the 13th. Special voting opportunity will also be around October 1st and the 15th. And vote by mail will begin at the end of September. Saturday, October 15th is election day. Voting hours will be from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Now let's talk about who is eligible to be a candidate. These are the key principles that you need to uphold as an elected official in fulfilling your roles and responsibility. They're meant to guide you in your new role. What we wanted to focus on, as an elected official, be honest and demonstrate strong ethical principles. You have an obligation, and you have to be willing to accept the responsibility or to account for one's actions. You'll have due regard for others' perspectives, wishes, and rights. Respect the offices of the local government and the role of local government in community decision-making. Ability to lead, listen to, and positively influence others, coming together to create or meet a common goal through collective efforts. Most importantly, you don't need to be an expert in any areas of the city as a council member. You just need to want to learn and engage with others. We'll provide you with all the information so you stay informed before making those decisions. The ministry has great resources available, which we'll have on our election page. So to qualify as a candidate for the office, you must be 18 years or older on election day, a Canadian citizen, a BC resident for at least 6 months before nomination, not disqualified under the Vancouver Charter or any law for being nominated, being elected, or holding office, not subject to any disqualifications set out under the section of the Vancouver Charter. So essentially, there's no job requirement, you just need to be willing to learn and work together. What if you're not a resident of Vancouver? It is okay to run in the municipal election in Vancouver. We just make a note of your municipality in the voters guide that we publish. So you're not eligible as a candidate if you are disqualified under the rules of Vancouver Charter or LECFA. Elections BC will speak a little bit about this as well later on. You can run for one office only, except it is okay for you to run for council and school board, but not okay for you to run for council and park board. I will now touch briefly on the rules for employees if they want to run as candidates. They can engage in political activities during their personal time, not work time. Must not impair ability to perform their duties in an impartial manner. They have to notify the supervisor of their intention to run. And they would have to take a leave of absence during campaign period. And of course, if elected, they must resign from the city. For our current council members, they cannot use city resources for any election campaign or campaign-related activities as outlined in the Code of Conduct. So there are going to be 4 races on the ballot with 27 positions to be filled. To be elected are 1 mayor, 10 councillors, 7 park board commissioners, 9 school board trustees. Also on the ballot, there will be 3 questions, typically 3 questions, what we call assent voting, for electors to answer on whether they want the city to borrow money to fund capital projects over the next 4 years. These capital projects could be a new community center or a new fire hall. And we'll go into the election framework now and focus on the roles. So the Vancouver Election Office is my office, and our responsibility is all the tasks related to voting as outlined in the Vancouver Charter. Elections BC maintains the provincial voters list, and they provide an excerpt of the voters list to the city to administer the election. They also administer the Local Election Campaign Financing Act. Ministry of Municipal Affairs is responsible for a legislative framework that governs local government elections. So our role with the City of Vancouver. Council appoints the Chief Election Officer to ensure that the general local elections and by-elections are run and delivered in accordance to the Charter. My role is to ensure that enough ballots are prepared, enough staff are trained to support voting, accept the completed nomination documents during nomination period, declare an election at the end of the nomination period, recommend changes to the election bylaw to improve aspects of the election process. An example would be amending the time of when we can open vote by mail packages. That language is in the election bylaw, and with the vote by mail now available to all voters, we need to make sure that we have enough time to process the ballot packages for the official result. I'm also responsible for setting voting opportunities and places, tabulating the votes and declaring the election results, preparing instructions on how to register to vote and how to vote. Also note that Vancouver School Board delegates the authority to me to conduct the school trustee election. So the next slide here contains a number of things that, and if you look at the left column, these are the responsibilities that we have to meet to deliver the election, as mentioned earlier in my role. We have to provide 2 legislated advanced voting opportunity plus general voting day. There's statutory ads that we have to make sure we have in place, and typically there are around 4 of them. They're printed this time in the local paper, but likely in 2026, the next municipal election, it will be online. Some of the additional offerings, which is the column on the right, these are additional offerings that we provide, and we're not required to provide them. But we do provide additional advanced voting days. We have assisted ballot marking devices. There's no rules around how many voting places we need to provide, but we have a set of guidelines to help us select voting places to ensure accessibility and the coverage of the citywide. Voting places will be made available in the summer. And those of you who are looking to have a campaign office, please note that the 100-meter requirement from a voting place. So if it's within 100 meters, there's restrictions around what you can do during voting, active voting. So we can talk a little bit more about that. The other thing I want to mention is we do publish the voters guide, and this is an important guide for voters because it contains candidates information, so your information that you provide to our office, your biography, and also includes information about voting opportunities and voting places. So in 2018, we conducted the first ever post-election survey, and these are the reasons why voter turnout was low. So what is our plan this year? We want to focus on what we have control over for 2022. We have asked the ministry for a longer nomination period to address the lack of knowledge of candidates. As you can see on this list, it impacts a few, there was a few reasons why people didn't come out to vote. However, it does require a charter change. This currently is 26 days. We're asking for 87 days, for example, the longer period, similar to the City of Toronto. The province will review our requests for 2026 as it's not enough time for this upcoming election. It does impact the legislation, the Local Election Campaign Financing Act, so we need some time to look at the impacts. The expansion of the mail ballot, as I mentioned earlier, is now available to all voters. This will make it more convenient for people to vote, especially during the COVID times. We're also going to be supporting All Candidates Forum. We'll encourage organizations to host them, and we can help disseminate the information to voters. So that is the end of my presentation. I am now going to invite our guest speakers to present. We have with us tonight Arielle Guetta, pronouns she, her, is a senior planning analyst with the Governance and Structure Branch, Local Government Division of the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. She has been with the branch since 2012, serving in a variety of different roles supporting local governments. From Elections BC, we have Doug Kimola, pronouns he, him, is the compliance officer with the Electoral Finance at Elections BC. Doug began his career at Elections BC with voter services in 2018, assisting with the referendum on electoral reform, and then transitioned to the electoral finance work on both the provincial and local events. Doug enjoys playing disc golf and taking his border collie to the dog park. Joining him is Mark Thompson, pronouns he, him, is the team lead for Electoral Finance Compliance Services at Elections BC. Mark has been with Elections BC since 2013, beginning as an electoral finance reviewer and working his way up to the compliance officer position, now in his current role as team lead. Mark enjoys being active and playing squash, as well as working on his vegetable garden in the summer. Over to you, Arielle. Sorry, Arielle, I think you're muted.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. Sorry, I just have to move something. Today, I'm going to be talking about the role of the Ministry of Municipal Affairs in general local elections. So the role of the ministry can be broken down into four main categories. We have a coordinative role. We work on legislative amendments. There are some provincial approvals that are related to elections, and we also do guidance and advice. Okay, so talking a little bit about all of the players. So there are over 250 jurisdictions involved during general local elections, and those jurisdictions are looking to fill over 1,600 positions. So that means that a lot of different bodies are involved to support general local elections. As Rosemary mentioned, the three that are most visible to candidates are the city or the regional district, the Elections BC, and the province, which includes the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Transportation. Ministry of Transportation regulates signs along provincial highways. So that is sometimes involved with candidate signs that go up there. In addition, there are several players behind the scenes that support the development of education resources for candidates and staff, help with legislative amendments and other election activities. So these bodies include the Local Government Management Association, known as LGMA, the Union of BC Municipalities, known as UBCM, BC School Trustees Association, or BCSTA, and boards of education. One of the roles that the ministry plays during elections is coordinating all these different players to work on guidance and education and just make sure that we're all working together during the elections. And this is done through, it's called the Technical Advisory Committee. Another role the ministry has is making legislative changes related to local government elections. School trustee election changes are done by the Ministry of Education. So these changes are based on feedback we hear from local governments and our partner organizations, as well as Elections BC. Rosemary mentioned a couple of the changes for 2022, but I'll do a more fulsome discussion of them. So there's the 30-day residency requirement, which has now been removed for resident electors. And this was done to address the disenfranchisement of individuals who move from one jurisdiction to another during the 30-day period before an election. The 30-day requirement is still in place for non-resident electors. Canvassing. So in order to align with recent changes in the Elections Act that enables provincial candidates and their authorized representatives the right to enter certain properties for the purpose of canvassing, amendments have been made to ensure that reasonable accommodations must be made to provide local candidates and their authorized representatives access to residential properties such as stratas, to canvass voters and distribute candidate information. Another big change is the eligibility for mail ballot voting, which has now been expanded to all eligible voters, but not all jurisdictions will be offering mail ballot voting. You have to pass a bylaw to provide it. I understand from Rosemary that the City of Vancouver is providing mail ballot voting for 2022. As well, there was a bill passed in fall of 2021 that would make consideration of a code of conduct a requirement within 6 months of an elected body being elected. So this requirement is not in force yet, but we do anticipate that it will be in force in time for after the 2022 election. The last two bullets about the pre-campaign period and the requirement for electoral organizations to register will be covered by Elections BC in their portion. Another role for the ministry is around provincial approvals. Some sections of the election legislation require minister approval before they can be used. So most of these will not be of much interest to candidates, but the one that you should be aware of is the approval for withdrawal of a candidate after the deadline. So as Rosemary mentioned, that deadline is September 16th, 2022. If a candidate needs to withdraw after this deadline, then a minister's order is required to allow it. And ministry staff work with the chief election officer to fully understand the context of the withdrawal and timing considerations. So for example, whether ballots have already been ordered. It is not a given that the minister will provide an order to allow the withdrawal. There have been instances where the withdrawal is denied, and then it's up to the candidate, if they do not want to be elected, to let people know that you don't want to be elected. Because your name will still be on the ballot. Another role for the ministry, and this one takes up a lot of our time leading up to elections, is around guidance and advice. We are currently working on updating our materials from 2018 and finalizing some new materials. We expect that these will be available on our website within the next month or so. This is a comprehensive list of all of the education materials that we will be creating. I'll highlight a couple of new ones for this year. So we now have a voter's guide to local elections for voters living on reserve. And this is intended to provide information for First Nations members and non-Indigenous BC residents living on reserve about voter eligibility, registration, and where to vote. This is a topic we get a lot of questions on. There's also a scrutineer's guide to general local elections, and this is intended to help clarify the role of scrutineers, how to be appointed, and how to prepare to represent a candidate at a voting opportunity. We are also working on a video series called Being an Effective Elected Official. And this was a panel discussion done with 4 current elected officials discussing what does responsible conduct mean, how do you build relationships with your other elected officials, how do you engage in healthy conflict, and generally providing advice about what it means to be in office and how to do that effectively. And finally, one of the resources I would like to highlight is this picture of a brochure that's on here now. So we have a brochure that we created last election called Thinking About Running for Local Office, and it will be updated for this year. It's a great resource for potential candidates looking at running because it covers everything you might want to think about before you decide to run. And I would also encourage you to visit our website, which is at the bottom, to find all of our resources. We also have a comprehensive candidates guide that walks you through all of the rules, with the exception of all the campaigning stuff, which is covered by Elections BC. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Arielle. Now I'm going to invite Mark and Doug to present.
Good evening. Thanks very much. My name is Mark Thompson. Just want to confirm I'm not on mute here for a second.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thanks so much. I'm just going to have to exit the screen and redo this a little bit here. Pardon me a moment. Pardon me. Sorry. We practiced this and now I'm having trouble. Here we go. Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Mark Thompson. So I'm the Compliance Services team lead here at Elections BC. And with me today is Doug Kimola, one of my compliance officers. So I'll begin tonight just by talking about our office's role in local elections, a few changes that have happened since 2018, and just an introduction to the campaign financing rules for the 2022 general local elections. Doug will then take over about halfway through and talk about election expenses and limits, election advertising, disclosure statements, and monetary penalties. So as was mentioned, our role in local elections in BC is to administer the Local Elections Campaign Financing Act, or LECFA as we like to call it for short, because it's a bit of a mouthful. LECFA contains the campaign financing and election advertising rules for local elections. What this means is that we oversee the rules for how candidates, elector organizations, and third-party sponsors can receive contributions and how they can spend their money. There are also rules for election advertising, such as ensuring that most election advertising contains an authorization statement, and we'll touch on this a little bit later in the presentation. LECFA also covers the registration of elector organizations and third-party sponsors, and the financial reporting requirements for all of the regulated participants in the electoral process. We've mentioned this term a few times now, just so for those that don't know, an elector organization is also called a civic or municipal political party. We don't oversee the remainder of the electoral process, such as appointing a chief election officer, conducting the candidate nominations, and conducting the voting itself. This part of the process, as we've mentioned, is done by the chief election officers at the municipality and overseen by Arielle and team at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. So what's new for 2022? LECFA was amended in 2021 by the legislature to change some of the rules for local elections. The most significant change is that these elector organizations now have to register directly with Elections BC and file annual financial reports. Previously, they would just file endorsement documents with their local jurisdiction each election. Now they'll have to be registered with our office before the election and file their endorsement documents with both the city and with our office here at Elections BC. The financing rules for elector organizations are slightly different as well, and basically what it did is removed the possibility of non-campaign funds from being used. There will also be a pre-campaign period for general local elections, which has not happened before. So this period will start on July 18th, and it will end when the campaign period starts on September 17th. During this period, the election advertising rules are going to be in effect. And what this means for you is that on your election advertising, you'll need to include that authorization statement during this period, whereas before, you only had to do that in the campaign period. Lastly, the changes introduced a series of administrative monetary penalties that can be given by Elections BC for more significant matters of non-compliance with LECFA. Doug is going to talk about this in more detail near the end of the presentation. So as we've mentioned, there is a shared responsibility for administering local elections in BC between Elections BC and each local jurisdiction across the province. We keep in regular communication throughout the election in order to make the process as easy as possible for everyone. As a quick summary, each candidate will submit their nomination documents directly to their local jurisdiction, who will then provide some of that information to us, including contact information for the candidate and their financial agent if they appoint one. Elections BC will then use this information to send important campaign financing information to these candidates and their financial agents, and to provide some resources and outline their responsibilities. We know the nomination period is a very busy time for everyone, but if you have any questions during this time, please don't hesitate to contact our office. We do have resources and staff available to help. The campaign financing rules under LECFA are aimed to provide a level playing field, and they focus on transparency and disclosure. We'll go through several campaign financing topics today that will apply to most campaigns, but we'll leave out the more complicated scenarios that apply to the larger campaigns. If you do have more specific questions on those, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Before we proceed, I would just like to provide a helpful tip, and that is to keep as detailed records as you can. Following the election, each candidate will need to file what's called a disclosure statement with our office that discloses all of the finances for the campaign. This includes all of your contributors' details, including their home address, and details of when the expenses are used. It is always a good idea to keep track of when you were using the expenses and not so much when you purchase them, because the election expense rules are always based on when you use something and not when you purchase it. And what this does is help to provide a level playing field. So for example, if the folks with more funds than others decided to go and purchase their signs in January, if they didn't have to put those expenses up against their spending limit, they would have an advantage there. And so that's why all these rules are based on when things are used and not when they're purchased. One of the first things that you'll do as part of your election campaign is determine who will be your financial agent. Candidates may appoint one at any time, but typically the first time that you will file an official document for this is with your nomination documents that you'll fill out and provide to the city. Candidates can also act as their own financial agent. So if you choose not to appoint another person to do this, you, the candidate, are responsible for administering your campaign finances in accordance with LECFA. Which is, of course, the role of the financial agent, is to administer the campaign's finances in accordance with LECFA. This includes opening a separate campaign account if there are any financial transactions, including if the candidate is just spending their own money. That has to go through a separate campaign account and not just be used from the candidate's personal account. Financial agents are also responsible for accepting contributions and approving and paying for election expenses. Once again, please try and remember to record as many details as you can about these transactions. It will make filing the disclosure statement after the election way easier. Campaign accounts.
Sorry,
as I
Mark.
Oh.
My apologies for interrupting. I was wondering if you could slow down just a little bit so that we could catch up with the closed captioning.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll just pause for a moment. So, as I mentioned, financial agents need to open a separate campaign account for each election campaign if they have any financial transactions. All monetary transactions must go through this campaign account. Please don't collect cash contributions and use that cash to pay for something. The cash must be deposited first and then used to pay for the expense. This provides a clear record of what happened and is important for transparency, which is a fundamental concept of the legislation. If you have any issues opening a campaign account, there is a letter on the Elections BC website that you can give to your financial institution or your bank. What this letter does is state the requirements that candidates do need to open their campaign accounts, and sometimes this needs to happen before the nomination period. And so this letter just helps the banks to realize what the legislative requirements are. If you're at the bank and you're having any issues with this, you can also call our office and we would be happy to explain to the bank what the requirements are for candidates. Campaign contributions are generally the main source of funds that candidates will receive during an election campaign. Typically, this is when a person gives you money for your campaign, but it can also include a few other things, such as a person providing an in-kind contribution, which is them giving you goods or services for your election campaign. We'll go through this information in the next couple of slides and provide some information on who is allowed to contribute, what the contribution limits are, and how you can record and disclose this information. Campaign contributions can only be made by what are called eligible individuals. An eligible individual is a person who is a resident of British Columbia and either a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident of Canada. People who do not meet this definition are not allowed to make a campaign contribution. All organizations, including corporations, trade unions, nonprofits, etc., are also not permitted to make campaign contributions. There is an annual contribution limit of $1,250 for the calendar year of 2022. The limit is adjusted each year, either by regulation or by an adjustment using the Consumer Price Index. And what this does is increase the contribution limit for inflation. You can find the limit for previous calendar years on our website if you need that information. The limit applies to each campaign, so an eligible individual is allowed to contribute $1,250 to each candidate in the election. For candidates that are endorsed by an elector organization, that limit applies to that group, the elector organization, and their candidates. So a person could give $1,250 in total to that group. The candidates themselves are allowed to provide a little bit more to their campaigns. They're allowed to give an additional $1,250 above the limit. So candidates in the election year for 2022 can give a total of up to $2,500. On the screen, you will see a few examples of campaign contributions. Money is the obvious one, but you can see there are other examples as well. Sometimes folks will provide property or services, such as office supplies, furniture, or other campaign equipment, and this needs to be valued and recorded as a contribution. Anonymous contributions are also permitted of $50 or less. And don't forget, any donations of your own money to your campaign is recorded as a campaign contribution, just as if it was from somebody else. You might have some other income or transactions that are more incidental to your campaign, but are not campaign contributions. This can include surplus funds from a previous election if you happen to run in a past election, and those are returned to you by your jurisdiction. If you are endorsed by an elector organization, you can transfer money between your candidate account and the elector organization account. Other income that is not reported as a contribution also includes certain types of fundraising income. If you'd like more information on this, please let us know, as the rules for fundraising functions can get quite complex. At this point, I'll now turn the presentation over to Doug to talk about election expenses, election advertising, and filing your disclosure statement.
That old mute button. Thank you, Mark. And here is a timeline of the 2022 general local elections. We are now in the election period, which began on January 1st. As Mark described, new for this election is the pre-campaign period. And just to reiterate, the expense limits do not apply to the expenses in the pre-campaign period unless you also use them in the campaign period. The main types of expenses you will have are called election expenses. This is further broken down into election period expenses and campaign period expenses. An election expense is the value of property or services used in your election campaign. The concept of when it is used is very important for election expenses. You will always report election expenses based on when you use them, not when you purchase them. Again, for example, if you buy your election signs in January and you only use them in the campaign period, this is a campaign period expense, not an election period expense. This is the main reason why it is important to record when you use your election expenses. If you don't record this, it can be very difficult to remember when you used each particular expense. There are expense limits that apply to campaign period expenses. These limits are based on the office you are running for and the population of your election area. We will publish these limits on our website as soon as they're available to us, which will be next month in May. Elector organizations do not have their own expense limits and will essentially share their candidates' limits through what's called a campaign financing arrangement. If any of you are planning to be endorsed by an elector organization, please reach out to Elections BC and we can help you with that process. There are a few rules to be aware of for election expenses. The financial agent will need to approve all expenses. And again, if you do not appoint a financial agent, you are considered your own financial agent. For payment, it can be paid directly from the campaign account, or reimbursed from the campaign account to an individual who has been authorized by the financial agent to pay for that expense. Please remember to always keep receipts and a record of the reimbursement. Sometimes independent candidates will decide to campaign together and share expenses. In addition to the rules we just talked about, there are rules for shared election expenses. Each candidate has to pay for their fair share of the expense. One candidate cannot cover the cost of another candidate's expense. And lastly, there could be some incidentals, such as paying a nomination deposit, and these need to be reported as well to make sure you are recording all of those details. Next, we are going to talk about election advertising. Election advertising is any communication transmitted during the pre-campaign or campaign period that promotes or opposes directly or indirectly the election of a candidate or an electoral organization. In the campaign period, it also includes advertising that takes a position on an issue with which a candidate or an electoral organization is associated. New for this election is the concept of commercial canvassing, or paid canvassing for simplicity. Generally, if you pay someone to canvass voters in person, or by phone, or over the internet to attempt to influence how they vote, this is election advertising. The effect of this is that the person doing the canvassing must provide the authorization statement, and they can do this by stating it verbally or by showing the person a written authorization statement. We will talk a bit more about authorization statements in just a minute. There are a few tips we can provide for election advertising as well. For placing election signs, it is always a good idea to check with your municipality for election sign bylaws, as they can often restrict when and where they can be placed. There are rules for advertising around voting places while it is taking place. There can be no election signs, distribution of election advertising materials, or canvassing voters within 100 meters of a voting place while voting is taking place. There are further restrictions on general voting day when you are not allowed to transmit election advertising to the public. This includes things like TV, radio, and newspaper ads, robocalls, or paid ads on social media. This brings us to two very common topics: social media and robocalls. The rules are the same for both. When they are paid for, they are election advertising and must contain an authorization statement. They cannot be used on general voting day unless the message is entirely to get out the vote and does not promote any candidates or electoral organizations. There are a few things that are exceptions to the definition of election advertising under LECFA. Things like letters to the editor, news, articles, interviews, etc., that are published without charge in a bona fide media are not election advertising. Internet messages that do not have a placement cost on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc., are not election advertising. However, as soon as you pay for placement, such as using banner ads, pre-roll videos, sponsored Facebook posts, these messages are now election advertising. One tip we would like to mention here is that many local governments will post biographies of candidates on their website or distribute them to voters. These are not election advertising unless the local government decides to write their own biographies that promote or oppose certain candidates. So here's an example of an authorization statement that must be on election advertising. This simply needs to state that the advertising is authorized by the financial agent or the candidate if they are their own financial agent, and provide a piece of contact information. Some things do not require an authorization statement. For example, clothing, face masks, or novelty items such as buttons, badges, wristbands, or pens, etc. For election advertising on the internet, sometimes it is not practical to have it on the ad itself. It is allowed to have the authorization statement on a landing page if that landing page is taken, if the person is taken to that landing page by clicking on the ad. Okay, now we can talk a little bit about third-party advertising. Generally, the definition of third-party advertising is election advertising that is not conducted by a candidate or elector organization. Third-party advertising is only regulated during the pre-campaign and campaign periods, so July 18th to October 15th. Third-party advertising sponsors have to register with Elections BC before they conduct their advertising. They also have contribution limits and expense limits in place, similar to candidates and elector organizations. Third-party sponsors must be independent of candidates and elector organizations. They cannot work with a candidate or elector organization, and they cannot coordinate their advertising with them. Each participant must file a disclosure statement with Elections BC that discloses the finances of their campaign. The filing deadline is 90 days after general voting day. So for these 2022 general local elections, the deadline is Friday, January 13th, 2023. There is also a late filing deadline on February 13th, 2023, but you will need to pay a $500 late filing fee if you filed during that, by that period. We will send each participant their disclosure statement forms after the election. Please also to remember, file your statement directly with us and not your local government. Elections BC has a team to help you complete your statement, so please do not hesitate to contact us. All disclosure statements, including amendments and supplementary reports, are made available to the public on the Elections BC website. We will redact the residential address of any contributor before publishing. The publication occurs after the filing deadline, so you don't need to worry about your information being made public before anyone else's. To that end, we encourage you to file early so that if there is something missing that might prevent us from accepting your disclosure statement, we can contact you and give you time to fix it before the deadline. Once your report is filed, it is transferred to our audit and assessment team. They review reports for compliance with the legislation, and if any issues are found, may request a supplementary report. A supplementary report is a refiling of the disclosure statement that resolves any issues either identified by our office or the financial agent. With these supplementary reports, your whole set of forms need to be submitted, not just the ones that are changing. LECFA empowers Elections BC to require that audits be conducted at our discretion. To be prepared, please ensure that clear and accurate records are maintained at all times. After the disclosure statement filing requirements have been met, candidates and elector organizations must keep their financing records for 5 years after general voting day. And lastly, I would like to touch on a new set of rules under LECFA, which is Elections BC's ability to administer monetary penalties for instances of non-compliance. These penalties can be given in relation to prohibited contributions, exceeding contribution or expense limits, or failing to include the authorization statement when required to. There are penalties that can also apply to other participants as well, such as elector organizations or third-party sponsors failing to register when required to. For all instances where a monetary penalty is possible, it will be referred to our investigations team. They will thoroughly look at the issue and will always give you a chance to tell your side of the story before administering a penalty. When a monetary penalty is issued, a notice of non-compliance is published on the Elections BC website. These notices provide information about the situation and the actions taken by the non-compliant individual or group to fix the situation. There is also the ability to seek court relief from monetary penalties and other types of penalties under LECFA. So that concludes our presentation for today. And on the screen, you will see contact information for Elections BC, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and UBCM. And now I'll turn it over if there are any questions. And thanks again for the opportunity to be here. I hope everybody enjoys the remainder of the conference.
Great, thank you very much to our guest speakers tonight. If I could have our guest speakers on video so we could move on to questions. We have time for some questions. So if you haven't yet, please use the chat or the Q&A function. If you're in person, please write down your question and head it over to the city staff that can pass it on to us. I will read out the questions without identifying who asked the questions. And if we don't get to your question, please email us at election@vancouver.ca. Okay, so we have the first question for Elections BC team. Are there time limits on when I can start advertising my candidacy using a personal website?
Great question, thank you. No, there are no time limits for when you can start advertising or campaigning. However, just please be aware that any expenses you do incur, regardless of when, those expenses need to be reported in your disclosure statement, and you'll need to pay for those using campaign funds.
Great, thanks for that. I'm sure there's a lot of information that would be helpful for our candidates. It's very complicated rules, as you mentioned before. Second question for our Elections BC team as well. For election advertising, what if someone canvasses as a volunteer? Do the rules apply to them as well?
Yeah, thank you. No, the rules will not apply if the person is a volunteer. The rules for canvassing is only if you're paying somebody to do so. So if you are paying somebody to do so, they will need to speak that authorization statement or just show a card with it written on there. But if a person is canvassing as a volunteer, that is not a requirement.
Great, thank you for that. Question for Arielle. As of today's date, what has been proposed as being included in the mandatory code of conduct?
So sorry, I maybe wasn't clear. There isn't a mandatory code of conduct. There is now a requirement that all councils or boards have to consider a code of conduct. So that's either adopting a new code of conduct or revising an existing one. What is in the code of conduct is not, there's no requirements in the legislation. We do have a guide that helps councils prepare a code of conduct, but there's no mandate about the code of conduct, just that you have to consider it. And if a local government decides not to adopt a code of conduct, then they just have to be able to provide reasons why they decided not to adopt one, and they have to revise it, review their decision before the next general local election.
Okay, and if I could add to that, for the council positions in the city of Vancouver, we do have a code of conduct that was adopted by council, and we have that available on our website. The next question is for me: how will the order of names on the ballot be determined in this election? So in 2018, we had a random ballot draw where we have all the names for each races placed in a barrel and randomly picked, and that's the order of the ballot that the names that they would appear on the ballot. This year, we will be looking at putting numbering sequence just to make it easier for candidates when they're campaigning, and easier for voters to find the candidates that they're looking for on the ballot. As you saw in my presentation in 2018, we had 158 names, so very, very long list. So we're trying to make it easier for voters in 2022. The next question would be, I guess we could open it to the other folks as well. Sorry about my late. What professional experience is required to become a candidate? Do you need to be someone with lots of work experience? As I mentioned in my presentation, and also in the first session that we had a few weeks ago, you don't need to have experience within the city. I think as long as you're willing to work with others, and lots of reading that you'll have to do in preparation for meetings, and so that you have the information before making a decision. And also we have orientation sessions that we'll set up for you after the inauguration, just to get you up to speed on what the priorities are for each department. Maybe if I can turn it to Arielle, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we have some videos on our website for prospective candidates that are currently there, that's not part of the new series, that do talk about what does it mean to be an elected official, and working with others, as Rosemary said, knowing what your role will be. So you're not the ones doing the work, you're the ones deciding on the strategy. So respecting the role of staff as well. It is a big time commitment, but it's also a very rewarding experience. It's a great way to give back to your community, to be involved. Yeah, so you don't need to have specific work experience, just a real interest in making your community as great as it can be.
Yeah, and we also have the recording from the last session that talks about the time commitment as well. So if you have a chance, do check it out. The next one is, for me, lack of knowledge about candidates is a problem. Would organized candidate debates be of value? Absolutely. We know it takes so much time in a very short period to get to know 158 candidates from 2018. So that's why one thing we are asking the ministry to consider having a longer nomination period, just so we could the voters have time to look at and review, to get to know the voters, the candidates. Again, you know, the All Candidates Forum, we highly encourage candidates to attend. We will help facilitate that information. We'll post that on our website. You know, if you sign up for our updates, you'll have that information as well. Absolutely, any way you can be out there to talk about your candidacy. Absolutely, you should do that. The next question would be for Mark or Doug. If a candidate is running with a party, does the financial agent file on behalf of all candidates, or do candidates have to file independently?
Yes, so a financial agent can be the financial agent for more than one candidate, or they could be the financial agent for the candidate as well as the electoral organization, but that's not necessarily the case. So you may have multiple financial agents, you know, one for each candidate within the organization, and then the organization might have their own. And certainly, we would hope that those financial agents coordinate with each other, especially between the electoral organization and the candidates, just to make sure that the contribution limits and expense limits, everything is being done within those.
Great, thanks, Doug. And I'll just confirm too that yes, a separate disclosure statement would be required for the candidate and the elector organization. We'll also make that pretty clear when we communicate with financial agents, and we'll provide reminders as well. So you certainly don't need to remember that information from tonight.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how does an independent candidate get their name known? Yeah, this is a challenge. We've heard it from independent candidates in the past. You know, we want to make sure that you have all the information to get you prepared for this journey. For example, this session. Also working with our communication person to make sure that we get information out there as well. We're using the voters guide as an example. Our website, we have the candidate's name, so there's the statutory ads that I mentioned earlier will have the names of the candidates published as well. So that's one way we can certainly help that. And also what I said earlier, if you have a chance to attend All Candidates Forum, please do. That's a good way to get your name known. The next question is for Doug or Mark. One of the speakers from Election BC talked about authorization statement and novelty items. Are they required on novelty items? I'm not sure if you understand that question.
No, yes. So a novelty item like a pen or a button, or even something like a business card, it's not required on those, or a T-shirt. It's mainly required on bigger advertising or any advertising done over the internet, but you can certainly sell or give away buttons with your name on it and not include that authorization statement.
Okay, great, thank you. Also for Mark or Doug, if a candidate is running with a party, does the candidate require a campaign account individually?
Good question. Only if the candidate is going to have some of their own financial transactions, then they will need to have a separate bank account of their own. If they don't have any of their own financial transactions and everything is done through the elector organization, then no, they do not need to open their own separate account.
Great. Do we have any other questions? We have a few more minutes to answer a few more questions, so maybe I'll give it a minute or two. There's one question, I think here, let's see. How are you engaging with Indigenous folks to run as candidates and highlighting issues that are especially concerned them? Yeah, we're looking for ways to work with the Indigenous organizations for future elections, definitely. We start with last year, having workers, recruiting them to work on election day. We're working, our outreach team are working with these, or with the Indigenous-led organizations. Definitely, we want to be able to address this issue. One more question for the election team. What is the period that the advertising rules apply?
That is July 18th through voting day on October 15th. And just to clarify, what that means is the advertising rules requiring the authorization statement apply during that time, but you still can advertise prior to that. You could advertise today. You could take out an ad in the newspaper if you like. The only difference there is you do not need to have that authorization statement, but it does still count as an election expense. So you'll need to pay for that with your campaign funds and report the expense in your disclosure statement.
Great, thank you. Another question for you. Are tax donations tax deductible?
No, unfortunately, they are not for local elections. So candidates in local elections are not allowed to issue tax receipts.
Great, thank you. The last question, I think, from the group is, does the city post candidate bios and photos on its municipal website? Yes, we will have the bios and candidates. What we have is Plan Your Vote tool, where it will have that information for you, including the voter's guide. So yes, definitely. I don't think we have any more questions. So, one more. Are there any rules around election literature using other languages other than English and French?
Yes, very, very little rules. Basically, you're welcome to advertise in whichever language that you like. The rule is just around that authorization statement. If you have an advertisement that is in a different language, you have to have the authorization statement in that language as well as in English.
Another question, if I fund my own campaign, what is my upper limit?
The most that you can contribute to your own campaign would be $2,500. And I'll just clarify once again, that is just the candidate allowed to contribute that much. Everybody else is limited to $1,250.
Great. Another question, do donations to independent candidates qualify for tax deductions?
No, they don't, unfortunately. No contributions for any local elections candidates or elector organizations are tax deductible.
Again, just to clarify that the donations are not tax deductible, correct?
That is correct. No tax receipts.
Great, thank you. Okay, we just give it one more moment for last minute questions. And attendees, if you have questions after the session tonight, please email us and we can either forward your question to Elections BC. We have their contact information posted as well on our website. There's so much information around campaign financing. So I know it's probably daunting for first-time candidates. So the team, the Elections BC team, is here to help you. We call them all the time, so you have that ability to do the same thing as well. Okay, let's see. What is the format for candidate order on the ballot? I'm not sure what that means. Format for candidate order. Maybe if I can get a clarification on that question, it would be randomized as how we've had it in 2018. We will add a number sequencing on it, as mentioned earlier. So hopefully I answered that question. There's another question here. Is there a ceiling on campaign spending, and where can I learn this?
Yes. So for an example, in Vancouver in 2018, if you were running to be the mayor, your spending limit was just over $210,000, and for a councillor was just under $108,000, and the same for a park board commissioner. Those amounts will be adjusted for against the consumer price index, and they will be posted in May on the Elections BC website. And speaking of the Elections BC website, I don't think we've mentioned there is a ton of information there as well, and we are currently updating many of our guidance materials that we will post online as soon as it is available, but there is already quite a bit of information on our website for local candidates.
Great, thanks, Doug. There's a clarification for a candidate with a party. Can they contribute $1,250 times 2? Is that right?
That's a little bit tricky, actually. For instance, if an elector organization is endorsing 4 candidates, those 4 candidates could all contribute $1,250 and then an additional $1,250 in total between the 4 of them. So let's see that. So between the 4 of them, they'd be contributing $6,250. That makes sense. It does get a little bit trickier when candidates are endorsed.
Yeah, this one's always a bit tougher to explain. So basically, every candidate endorsed by an elector organization, they get to make their regular $1,250 contributions, just like everyone else. And then between all of those candidates, they can give a combined extra $1,250. So whether that's one person giving an extra $1,250, or perhaps they split that between, I think, the 4 of them in Doug's example, so they would each give just over $300 each. It is a bit more of a complicated one to explain, but we do have a good image in our guide that we'll be releasing in the next week or 2 as well. If some folks are better visual learners, there's a good image in there.
Great, thanks for that tip. There's a question about how will candidate names be placed on the ballot. So I'm trying to understand the question. So the nomination period closes at 4 o'clock on September 9th, and there's a waiting period for a challenge. September 16th is when we do the random ballot draw. And once we confirm that, the ballot will be printed. So hopefully that answered the question. If not, please do send it in to clarify. Any more questions for us before we sign off? Okay, great. Thank you very much to our guest speakers from Elections BC and Ministry of Municipal Affairs, our ASL interpreters, closed captioners, and staff for making this event happen. Thank you for attending, whether it's in person or online. We hope this session was informative. The recording of the session will be available on our website with transcripts soon. When you exit the platform, you'll be directed to our feedback form, and you can click on the feedback form in the chat as well. Please do consider register for our next session on May 31st, where we will focus on the function of the city. And then the last session that we will host is in early June, I believe, that will focus around the nomination period. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thanks for having us.